Hey, thanks for checking out Next Level Carpentry and yet another episode in the ongoing pallet wood door build series. 9 previous episodes in the series bring us to the point where the door is all varnished, so it's ready for me to infill the pallets of this door with slats made from pallet wood. Talk about a spoiler, right? My intent was to make all these slats and apply them to the door in one video, but it turned out to be an hour-long master class on precision milling methods with a bunch of rabbit trails leading to a number of in-depth process explanations. It even has a section showing in detail how to use a thickness planer as a widthness planer. So I broke this into 2 separate episodes. This video is dedicated to making and finishing 44 slats of cherry out of pallet wood that I'll install in the next and final video, where I glue them to the face of the door in a unique gradient spacing, and the spaces are filled in with a brushed stainless steel laminate to give it a unique modern look that I think is pretty appropriate for the Next Level Carpentry shop. The final chapters of the series are a bit chronologically challenged, so bear with me as I work to bring this whole thing in for a landing, okay? Ready? Let's go. Making all the slats I'll use to fill in the pallets on this pallet wood door is largely an exercise in precision milling. With 20 slats and 19 spaces, the difference in spacing between each one in that gradient is less than 1/16 of an inch. So all this stuff needs to have a high degree of precision to get the result and the look that I'm after. All the slats for the door are going to be made out of cherry, and I got the cherry from runner parts like this. These are approximately 2x4 from Perfect Pallet runners, and I've pre-milled this stack of slats here. There's 44, I think, so I have enough slats and a few extras for practice. Basically what I did in that pre-milling was take a pallet runner, flatten a face, resaw it, and then resaw the second face so that all 44 of these pieces are extra wide, extra thick, and extra long from the way they'll end up. And I did that pre-milling some time back, so they've had a chance to stabilize in this configuration. And I'm not going to go through the process here of making these pieces from pieces like this, because it's kind of standard millwork. To get the overall look I'm after on the pallet wood door, I want to preserve the character of the pallet wood while eliminating its nature. And what I mean by that is I want to preserve all the knots and the checks and the splits, the cracks, and the pallet nail holes, while eliminating all of the twist, cup, bow, and wane out of those pieces. And the process has been started with these parts in the pre-milling process. They're pretty flat, pretty straight, and pretty consistent thickness, but you can still see the character in here, some nail holes, various things like that in these slats. Because I don't want anyone saying that I made up a story about making that whole door out of pallet wood like this. I'll get the precision necessary for milling all 40 of those slats out of crusty old 2x4 pallet runners like this using a systematic process with the joiner, table saw, thickness planer, and miter saw. Most of the steps I use for milling these pallet runner 2x4s into slats for the door are fairly routine use of standard shop equipment, with one exception, and that's when I use the thickness planer as a widthness planer for one of the final steps in milling the slats. So if that's something you've not seen before, I think you'll appreciate learning how to expand the capabilities of an already very capable and very versatile machine. So stay tuned for when I demonstrate the DeWalt DW735 widthness planer. The precision milling process starts, like most projects do, on the joiner, where I use it to mill one face of all these slats flat. I already mentioned that these slats have had quite a bit of time to acclimate, and I already flattened some of the distortion out of them from their original state. So this will just be a light pass on the joiner to clean up one face as a starting point for subsequent steps. To keep track of 84 faces on 44 pieces as I go through the milling process, I draw a quick squiggle mark on each face of each slat so that I know what's been planed and what hasn't. going forward. And you can see distinct lines from saw cuts in the faces of some of these pieces. That's left behind from the original resawing process that I used for cutting the pallet runners down into these blanks on the table saw. But it's no big deal because I've got plenty of extra thickness in these slats, so that'll get milled away long before the slats reach their final thickness. I like to mill the slats at full length if they're not too crooked, because that gives me more options for grain and character selection when I cut the pieces to final length later. But I chop pieces with a sharp crook or a nasty twist in them closer to their final length so that I have enough thickness to work with as I plane them down to their final thickness of 3/8 of an inch. That allows me to preserve pieces like this with beautiful character, even though they've developed a nasty kink or two. Thankfully though, even though this stuff is pallet wood, most of the slats are pretty flat and take just a light pass on one of the faces to true them up. And as long as that pass removes all the squiggle marks, I know that I've got one true face on each slat so that I can stack them clean, flat face down on the table saw and go through the whole stack, with the squiggle mark remaining on one face so that I can keep track of everything if the pieces get shuffled around. Before doing a large milling operation like planing all these slats to thickness, I like to give the platen in my DW735 thickness planer a heavy coat of paste wax so the pieces slide through more easily, which eases the work for the machine and also, interestingly, helps prevent snipe because the pieces glide instead of drag on their way through the machine. And this is the same waxing procedure that I use in the video I did a while back on the care and feeding of the DW735 thickness planer. And you can check that video out with the link in the corner of your screen. In this initial step of flattening one face of all 44 slats that average about 36 inches long, mean I'll be planing between 130 and 140 lineal feet of cherry slats for this step alone. So naturally, I've got the G700 dust processor collecting the chips as I go through so I don't end up wading through a pile when I'm done. Over the years, the main thing I've learned about consistency is, well, consistency. Now that each of these pieces has gone over the joiner at the same time with the same setting, they're ready to go to the thickness planer. And to keep the thickness planer results consistent, I draw a straight line down the jointed face so that each piece has a squiggly line that's not been planed and a straight line on the surface that has been planed. That helps me keep track of all these parts going forward. If one of these stacks gets knocked over, I know which side is which, because if the squiggle line goes through the thickness planer down instead of up, that piece is going to be inconsistent with the rest of them because it's being thickness planed from an unjointed face. Hope that makes sense. So I'll get these lines drawn on here and then proceed with pellet part planing. Post haste. For the planing process, I'll stage a stack of the slats on top of the thickness planer. I've got an outfeed roller set up over there so I can shove the pieces through one at a time, butting them end for end. That way, only the very first end of the very first piece and the last end of the last piece are even subject to snipe, because there's always a piece under the feed rollers that keeps the cutter head from rocking and causing that snipe in the first place. So again, it's a great way to get consistent results. I've got to fire up the dust processor for this, but you'll see the planing process in action. You can hear a lot of variation in the noise the planer makes while planing the first pass on all these slats. Some of these are different thicknesses just because of the way they were roughed out. Others come out come off the joiner with waves and stuff in them. And so even though the cutter head is set at a consistent height, it's taking off a different amount of material from each piece. This piece was planed all the way across. You can see the squiggle mark is gone. There's still a straight mark on the back, but the squiggle mark's all gone from the top. Pieces like this, the squiggle mark is gone from the end but not from the middle. And some of the pieces barely get touched at all because I had to take a couple passes on the planer. So the first pass is always a little bit less predictable because of the inconsistency of these rough sawn pieces going in. And I don't want to take too heavy a pass in the beginning, because when I'm done planing this face, I want it to be all consistently smooth throughout the stack. Once this face is done, I'll flip everything over and give a pass or two on the other side so that both sides have the planed 96 cuts per inch finish on them. Another advantage of not taking a heavy pass right away is that if one of these pieces goes through backwards and gets torn out, I can flip it end for subsequent passes to get a smoother planed result on the finished piece. Requires less sanding and looks nicer overall when done. And that's especially important with something like pallet wood, where the grain is all over the place, up and down and everything, and it can tend to chip out going through one way more than the other, and I want to minimize the chip out as much as I can. The rest of this is pretty boring, so I'll just come back to the camera when I've got all these pieces milled down to a consistent thickness, and then show you the next step for finishing up thicknessing of these slats. I'll make a few comments during a pause in the planing process here. I've gone 3 passes through the planer. That's like 450 lineal feet of planing. And I finally got all the squiggle marks removed from the top. So every piece is clean on one side and it's got the straight pencil mark on the other side. And in the process, I flipped some pieces end for end to get a smoother plane finish on there. And I even found a bit of a nail or part of a wire from a gun nail in one of the pieces that I got to get out of there. Well, I'll tell you, that little chunk of metal wasn't doing my planer blades any good, but I'm glad I found it at this stage before I changed out to new edges on those knives though. Looks like it must have been a piece of the wire that holds collated nails together. Just got embedded in there, so it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't good either. But now that everything's been planed to that level, I'm going to switch the knives in the thickness planer, and you can see how to do that in the video linked here, the care and feeding of your DW735 thickness planer. And that way I've got fresh clean knives for the last few passes. I'm currently at just over 7/16. I'm going to get these pieces down to 3/8. Here's a sample prototype piece I made out of maple. I got that much thickness to go and get these pieces cleaned up. And I wanted to mention that I'm going with passes about a 32nd of an inch. It's about a half a crank on this DW735, about a half a crank down at a time. The machine will easily handle a full crank, a 1/16 of an inch, but it just tends to tear things up a little harder on the machine, etc. And I'll take a couple more passes on this. As I'm going down, I'm looking at the faces now that they're both planed and cleaned up. I want to make sure both faces end up coming out of the thickness planer, meaning I want to get that jointed face off there, but I can do that with a 1/64 of an inch. So before I take the next pass, I'll look at each piece and figure out which side I want to remove the most material from. Some of these definitely have a good side and a bad side. Here's an example. This is kind of blank and blonde on this side. It's better on this side, so I'll take like 1.5 passes off of this side and a 1/4 pass off of that side, meaning I just take more off the least desirable face to preserve the look of it. It's a little bit of a moot point because this is pallet wood and it's also inconsistent and rough, but that's a good work practice to get into when you're just reducing thickness on a piece. Just try to reduce it from the B side instead of the A side, because as the board gets thinner, the A side and the B side meet somewhere, and when you want to have optimal appearance of the finished face, take the thickness off the B side and make sure the A side is just plain smooth, and you'll be in good shape. Now that I've removed the bulk of the extra thickness from all these slats from the back face, I'm ready to flip all the stacks over, top for bottom, end for end, and take one final pass off what will be the face of each slat. Because all this wood is pallet wood, it's in pretty rough shape, and even though I have new knives in the planer, I'm getting some streaks on the surface from nicks. There was other pieces of wire down in these nail holes, etc. and the blades got nicked from that, but I want the final pass to be nice and smooth. So I'm going to do a little tip that I showed in the care and feeding of the DW735 thickness planer, which is to shift one of the knives. And by doing that, it shifts the nicks in one blade so that they're offset from the nicks in the other two blades. And as long as the nicks aren't too big, I get a much smoother surface on the final pass on all these pieces. Because I install all the blades shifted to one side when they're new, all I need to do at this stage is to loosen up all the bolts and then shift one single knife to the other side of the range. You can see it there. This is how much the knives shift back and forth. I'm just shifting one knife to the other side. And that little adjustment right there saves me quite a bit of sanding on those slats. And anything I can do that's that easy to avoid that much sanding, I'm going to go for it every time. I double check and see that these pieces cleaned up at just over a ½ inch thick, which is a good thing because my final thickness is going to be 3/8. I think I already mentioned that. So I've got an 1/8 of an inch to go off of each of these pieces. So I'm going to flip everything top for bottom, end for end, like this, so that now all the straight line faces are going to be up. I flip them end for end because as long as the planer is planing smooth on this side, if you flip it end for end, that reverses the grain direction when you reverse the face, and it should plane smooth on the other face, which is my goal. So I'll flip the pieces top for bottom, end for end, take a 1/32 inch pass off of this side, and then go through the whole stack and decide where I want to take off another 1/16 of an inch, and then I'll clean it up at the end with that last shallow pass off the good face. Hope that makes sense, but it's part of the process of getting consistent results and the best looking yield from the pieces you have to work with. Before I flip all these pieces top for bottom, end for end, I'll just take a purple Sharpie marker, the color doesn't matter, and draw a little circle on one end of each piece. The shape doesn't matter, but that simple step at this stage saves quite a few minutes of examining the surface of the wood later if the faces get mixed up. And now, with the purple circles all on the bottom side of the piece, one final pass through the thickness planer to shave off the last 1/64 of an inch completes the process for milling all 44 of these pieces to identical thickness and with an identically milled top surface for the finished slats. And that final pass on all these pieces gives me 44 of them that are identically milled to 3/8 of an inch thick. While I want the final thickness on these parts to be very precise, it's not really all that critical. But for projects where it is critical, you can check your accuracy by stacking up pieces, which will highlight the combination of any error in the final dimension of the piece. These are all 3/8 of an inch thick, which is pretty easy to measure. 2 of them should equal 3/4 of an inch. 4 of them should equal 1.5 inches. 8 pieces should be 3 inches. And 12 pieces would be 4.5. If you look close, you can see that the error here is 1/12 of 1/64 of an inch, where they're just slightly thicker than they should be. And that ain't too shabby for a pile of pallet pieces. The next step in the slat milling process is to get them all to an equally consistent width. I mentioned this part earlier in the video. These pieces all range from 3 1/8 inches wide. Some of them are as skinny as 3 inches. And I roughed them out to that dimension because the final measurement I'm after is precisely 2 15/16 of an inch. And the reason I ended up with 2 15/16 for the final measurement on those is because when I was pre-milling, rough milling out of the original pallet runners, it was pretty obvious that I wasn't going to be able to maintain an original width of anything more than 3 inches. If I could have ended up with 3 1/4, great, I probably would have milled them all down to 3 inches, but some of them I could barely eke out 3 inches in the rough, and that gives me this final 1/16 of an inch to mill off the pieces now so that they're all exactly 2 15/16 of an inch. I hope that makes sense. The standard sequence for truing up pieces for width is to run one edge over the joiner, take a pass through the table saw, and then go back to the joiner for a final planed pass on the other side. But that induces opportunity for error in a few places, and the final edge then is only planed with the joiner. And that's not as fine of a surface as I can get from a thickness planer. So the method I use to get the best results, the most consistent results, and save myself some sanding is to convert my thickness planer into a widthness planer for the final sizing on all these pieces. I still start the sequence using the joiner with a very light pass. Remember, on some of these pieces I only have a 1/16 of an inch to work with, and I need to join it, table saw it, and do 2 passes on the thickness planer, so it's a very light pass. But hey, I got a whole 1/16 of an inch to work with, so it shouldn't be too bad. A great way to evaluate whether all these pieces are actually thick enough is to just line them up on edge. I can do that easily by just flipping them and stacking them next to the rip fence, like so. And then look through the stack for skinny minis. This is all pretty consistent in width. There's a few skinnies down in here. Let's see what this one measures. Yeah, that's not too bad. There's a skinny one at just like 3 1/32 of an inch. Somewhere in here I know there's a couple of real skinnies. Can't find them now, but this way I know what the kind of the maximum and minimum range of all these different pieces is. I'll take advantage of the occasion of having all these pieces stacked up here to draw some reference marks on them. I'm just drawing lines straight across on all the pieces. And in another step that doesn't really matter in this case, I'm going to flip the pieces all over edge for edge, like so. And I might as well orient the long ones and the short ones together while I'm at it. And with that little OCD step complete, I'll put another set of reference marks on this side, but I'll just put the lines at an angle. And those reference marks just help me keep track of which side is planed and which one isn't as I go through the process, because I don't want to double plane one edge and not plane one of the other edges at all. Now it's a matter of going through the stack one by one, straightening one edge, and then placing it on the table saw with a planed edge to the right, so that it rides along the rip fence when I rough rip these pieces to just a fuzz under 3 inches. Because the squareness of the edges on pieces when using the widthness planing process is so critical, I always make sure to double check my fence on the joiner before running those pieces, and then go with a very shallow setting that's just enough to put a clean cut on the entire edge of every piece. Because I rough milled these, they're nice and straight already, but this just reassures that I've got a clean planed edge that's square to the faces. You may notice the hand position I'm using. My forward hand is pushing pressure down and in on this piece to keep it up against the fence and down against the table. But my extra fingers are over the cutter guard as they pass over the cutter head, keeping that pressure in and down during the cut. And then as my second hand goes over the cutter head, my palm is resting on top of the fence so that there's no danger of slipping into the cutter head while milling these thin, narrow pieces. And it just takes a few minutes to clean up one edge of each of these 44 pieces before proceeding to the next step. I made 3 stacks out of the pieces as they came off the joiner. This side all has pencil marks, and most of them are the angled pencil marks. These sides are all planed clean. I'll just set the blade the customary 1/8 of an inch above the thickness, and then I'm going to set the width at 2 63/64. How do you like that? And at that setting, I should end up with a saw cut edge on every opposite edge. So they'll be planed on one side and a saw cut on the other side. As they come off the table saw, I'll stand them plane edge down, saw cut edge up for the transition into the widthness planing process. I'll be using one of my professional push sticks. This one has a modified heel that's only 1/4 of an inch tall, so that it pushes the workpiece through without catching on the edge of the table as I push it through, like the sticks with a 1/2 inch edge would do. If that edge is too tall, it sticks down and hits the edge of the table. You can see as each piece goes past the blade, the amount that's getting trimmed off varies. And that amount of variance highlights the need for this step at this time, because I want these pieces to be very consistent in width before I send them through the widthness planer on a final pass to clean them up. You can see in this stack of pieces that have the cut edge up that every piece didn't get cut entirely from one end to the other. So although they're too skinny to get ripped by the table saw at this step, they're still wide enough that the widthness planing pass will clean them up in the next steps. And it does show you the difference in the tolerance between the rough cut pieces and the finished cut pieces. It gets pretty tight on some projects, but as long as there's enough to get cleaned up in a final pass in the thickness planer, it's all good. And I'll mention it now in case I forget later. I go ahead and add reference marks on these cut edges of the pieces, putting them straight across again this time to differentiate them from the other side that's clean because the angled marks were planed off. And that really helps because there's little visual difference between an edge that's been cut on the table saw and one that's been planed on a joiner. And that quick step of adding pencil marks eliminates all confusion should these pieces get jumbled up as I go through these steps. Converting your thickness planer to a widthness planer is very simple. It's just a matter of running the boards through on edge like this rather than flat like you do when you're thickness planing. So even though my terminology is a little bit silly, it's a very useful process for getting consistent results when milling parts in batches like this. All the steps that I've gone through to get to this stage are equally important, and the better job you do with all this preparation, the better results you'll get when you're planing boards to width in a thickness planer. The fact that the pieces are all flat, they're all straight, and they're even thickness and relatively even in height are key for getting success with this step. With my pattern piece here, you can see if you look close that I've got a skinny 1/16 of an inch extra width in all these pieces that I'm going to clean up now. And the thing I'm paying the most attention to is to make sure when I run these pieces through, they stay in this orientation and that every edge gets milled till it's clean. There's these two pieces here. You can see they're darker. Those didn't get cut by the table saw. So I've got to run all the pieces through on this edge until that's cleaned up. Then I know I can flip them top for bottom, end for end, and plane over the other pass. That last pass on the back edge leaves the 96 cuts per inch finish on both faces and both edges of all these pieces. You'll get better results when feeding these through the widthness planer if you stagger the leading edge. I've got a wide variety of lengths here. I want to put them together in packets that are easy to handle. So I'll take, there's 4 long pieces, and I'll take a few of these shorter ones and just make packets that'll feed easily through the planer by staggering the ends like that. If the pieces are all the same length like this batch, I'll just shuffle the inner pieces forward so they kind of enter the planer in a point like that. Then I'll crank up the height setting on the thickness planer, which I guess in essence changes it to a widthness planer. And I'll set this to 1/64 of an inch, less than 3 inches. When the handle's in this position, it's at 3 inches, so I'll raise the cutter head 1/64 of an inch and run a batch through at this setting, which in effect coordinates the measurement that I used for ripping the boards on the table saw and this initial pass on the widthness planer. It's important that I pick up these bundles evenly, put them on top of the planer so that everything's lined up flat. And I like the staggering of the ends. I grip the stack firmly without letting it slip and feed it into the planer this way. What I don't want to happen is have these pieces tilt at all, because if they go through tilted, then I'm planing angles on here. They're going to flop over in the machine and just kind of make a general mess of everything. But as long as I hold them firmly and the bottoms are flat, this feeds just like it should. Oh yeah, and one last thing, when I'm running the Widthness planer, I'll put it on the slow feed rate, because planing these edges has a little more tendency to chip them if they're running through too fast. And this just gives a smoother overall finish and less worry about chip and chatter. You notice that I had to turn the crank down some more while the piece was running through the first time, because the cutter head was set too high and it didn't plane off anything. Now that these edges are done in the Widthness planer, I want to keep them oriented like that, not mix things up. So I'm actually going to put a mark with a green Sharpie on the bottom edge of these pieces so that I can keep track of them from here on out. I'm going to run this stack through because this is the one with the skinny pieces in it, and I just want to see if this setting will clean off those pieces all the way. I kind of think they're too skinny to get it, but let's find out. Well, it's really close. You can see it almost got that cleaned up. I've still got a full 32nd of an inch to clean up these pieces to get them to the final width. So I'll run everything through like this. I'll take another 64th of an inch, which should clean that up. And then in the end, I'll flip everything over and hit that last edge last. I went through all these pieces with that initial setting. Now I'll lower the cutter head just as much as I can to clean up this face. And I know that if I've got even an 1/8 of a turn at the end, which is 128th of an inch, it'll be enough to clean up this side perfectly smooth, because they're already so clean and flat and straight from the joiner. The last pass on that underside, all that has to do is clean up the scallops from the helical head on the joiner to the 179 cuts per inch that the Widthness planer leaves on the pieces. So I lowered that a strong 64th of an inch, and here goes. Admittedly, the precision that I'm getting out of these parts for this project is pretty much overkill, but I wanted to go through all the steps here to show you what's possible when you're doing this sort of thing. I use the same process for making face frame parts when they're 1.5 inches wide, 1 3/4, whatever. I run them all through so everything's the same consistency or the same dimension, and as long as I'm going through it, I might as well get a really great job, right? So all these pieces are Widthness planed on this face, and there's green marks on the bottom of this end on all the pieces, like this. So I know that each one of these stacks has to be flipped top for bottom, end for end. And what that typically does is, if the edge planes smooth when going through this direction, then this flips the grain orientation so that they're more likely to plane smoothly on this other side as well. Once they're flipped over, you can see all the green marks are up. I'll just re-stagger the ends for this feed orientation before I run them through the planer. And I know with my planer, when the handle is in the 9 o'clock position here, that I'm exactly on the measurement that I want on this scale. I don't go by what the scale says. I go by the position of the handle when the scale is near the mark, which in this case is 2 15/16. I know I'm spot on with this, with that extra bit of rotation here. If you look closely at the pieces at this stage and my pattern, which is exactly 3 15/16, this slight amount of difference here that might even show up if you're looking close is how much extra width I have to plane off the marks. And you can see here on this piece where there's a little bit of a smudge on the edge of the board that shows the scallops from the joiner. And once I've run this through the Widthness planer again, it'll be perfectly smooth like this. This surface is so smooth, I can wipe that with 320 grit sandpaper and it's ready for a finish. And you can see those scallops from the joiner left on the faces here on these other stacks. I could eliminate some of that by using a slower feed rate on the joiner, but the Widthness planer is not only better, but it's incredibly faster. And to bring home a point here, I'll put a pencil mark down the full length of one edge of each of the slats in this final batch so that you can see the slats go into the Widthness planer with a pencil mark on them and come out the other side with the pencil mark removed. And this when the planer is taking a strong 1/128 of an inch of wood off the edge of all these pieces to give me a perfectly smooth final finish on these edges. And each piece is absolutely identical in width to my original pattern piece that measures 2 15/16 of an inch. And I hope you can see with the end result of this Widthness planing process the benefit of having both a thickness planer and a Widthness planer in your shop, because this sort of consistent results are difficult to get with any other process. And if you like the kind of content that you're seeing in this video where you can get results like this from standard shop equipment, I hope you'll subscribe to Next Level Carpentry if you haven't already. I've put a link to an Amazon influencers page in the video description below, and on that list are all the various machines, tools, equipment, and supplies you see in use in this and other videos on Next Level Carpentry. You can sure use those links to get those tools or supplies if you can't find them locally. And as an influencer, Amazon pays small ad fees to this channel that helps support video production, even though the prices there are the same low online price that you expect. There's also a link to PayPal in the video description where you can tip the teacher if you're so inclined, get t-shirts and swag like this and the signs you see around the shop. And there's also a link to Patreon if you're interested in going above and beyond to support video production here. I'll include a little more about Patreon later, but for now I'm going to jump back into the build with the next step in making 44 slats for the pallet wood door. And the next step is to route a small radius on the show face of each one of these slats. While going through these stacks of slats to get the faces oriented, I realize there's quite a few of them where the face that I want is the opposite of what I thought I wanted. So on plenty of the pieces, the little O mark is going to be up because I like that face better. And the only downside is that it means I've got a little extra sanding to do on any piece that has an O up instead of down, because I flipped the side that I thought was going to be the back to the front. No big deal, and at least with those orientation marks, I know when I've got extra sanding to do. There's one right there. That grain on the back is a little richer and nicer than what I had selected for the front. And now that I have all the faces selected, I'll use a 1/16 inch roundover bit and a Bosch Colt router to ease the two edges on this face. And I'll just use a medium feed rate and a fairly high RPM to get a nice smooth routed profile on those corners. And when routing, I like to do a test run, especially with this teeny 1/16 of an inch roundover bit, because it's so easy to get it set too deep or too shallow. And once I do this, I don't want to have to redo 240 lineal feet of edges. That'll be perfect. Now it's showtime. And when I start routing from the square end of a piece, I always use a little backward stroke to get started and continue on routing the rest of the edge of the piece. And that technique keeps me from routing around the end of the piece in cases when it matters, even though this isn't necessarily one of those cases. And I just love the perfectly smooth, consistent results I get with these simple steps. Now that I'm finished routing both edges on the faces of all these pieces, I've got them lined up so the routed face goes that way. And the last milling step I have for these is to put a groove or a slot in both edges of every piece, and I want that slot to be 3/16 of an inch from the face to the slot. And the purpose for the slot in the edges of all these slats is to accept the brushed stainless steel laminate that I'll use to fill the spaces in between the slats. This laminate is a 32nd of an inch thick, and the skinniest slot cutter I could find was a 1/16 of an inch, and I didn't want to go to the trouble of having a custom slot cutter made, so I'll just use 2 pieces of laminate to fill that slot, and it'll actually work out better in the long run. And the best blade I found for making a nice clean 1/32 of an inch wide slot is this DeWalt blade made from my little cordless saw. Thankfully, it's got a 5/8 of an inch arbor, just like my Delta Unisaw. So I'll swap out the thin kerf blade that I normally use for this ultra thin kerf blade that will work perfectly for making slots in the slats. Slick, right? Unfortunately, the zero clearance insert that I normally use is off on holiday vacation, so I've got to use this wide kerf model that came with the Unisaw, even when that zero clearance insert would be most useful. Then I set the blade depth to 1/4 of an inch and set the rip fence to 3/16 of an inch to position this slot exactly where I want it for the design. And then, as usual, I test the settings and the setup on a scrap piece to make sure everything is just like it needs to be before I start cutting the actual work pieces. And that looks perfect. So now I can proceed cutting nearly 240 lineal feet of slots in both edges of 120 slats. And because I've done my homework all up to this point, I know the pieces will be consistently perfect at the end of the day. Because of the sheer volume of cutting I need to do for this particular step, I set up a feather board to keep the slot placement consistent and to keep monotony from causing my fingers to drift near the blade. First, I run a few more scraps through the setup, double check everything, and then proceed. Now that the setup's complete and the results are tested, I fire up the dust processor and make quick work of slotting the slats. Well, there it is then, well over 100 feet of pallet wood slats milled to perfection and ready to be sanded and varnished before I apply them to the pallets on the pallet wood door. And performing every step to this point has been pretty simple, so I've not worried about the extra length on all these pieces. These 4 maple slats were my proof of concept pieces, and they're cut to the exact length that I need for the finished slats. And you can see that the cherry pieces have extra length on them, and that way I can trim away snipe at the ends if necessary. And on the longer pieces, I can decide where to position the cuts to get optimal appearance of the finished slat for the door. And milling that extra length on the planer and the table saw, that's pretty simple. But since I don't care much for sanding, and I don't want to do a bunch of extra finishing, I'm going to trim these to rough length, a few inches longer than their actual finished length before jumping in to the sanding and finishing process. So I'll go through the stack of slats one by one and trim off any excess that I can at this stage by using one of the sample slats of the exact length as a pattern, and then just chopping the ends off on the miter saw. And that way I greatly reduce the amount of sanding and varnishing that I need to do to finish up the slats. Cutting all the milled slats down to a rough length of about 30 inches saves me about 25 lineal feet of sanding, which is what I've got here with all these cut off pieces. I'll use those for spacing the slats later. But that reduction in length is a good thing because my sanding process is 3 separate steps, and I don't have to do those 3 separate steps on that extra 25 lineal feet of material. And it's enough work as it is. I've finished one of these slats with this process, so it's butter smooth and ready for a gel poly finish. And the sanding process is boring enough as it is, so I won't go through it all, but I'll show you all 3 steps involved on one of these slats so you get an idea what it takes to prep these for a nice gel poly finish. The process starts with a quick scrape with a sharpened level 5 putty knife This is a 4-inch one, and I'm including this step because, as you remember, some of these pieces have a front and a back on them, and I ended up choosing the back. So it needs a little bit of scraping, and it's so fast that I'll just do it to all the faces to make sure they're good. And that quick scrape removes any little ribs that are left over from the nicked blades, because, as you remember, some of these faces I milled before I shifted the knife to reduce the number of nicks in the face. But it just takes a few seconds and it's well worth it. And you can see these little bits of fuzz that come off the workpiece. And that is basically what one of those little ribs looks like when it's scraped off with a sharp putty knife. Once I've scraped the face, I switch to 220 grit sandpaper. This is hook and loop sandpaper on one of these Gator sanding blocks. And the combination of sandpaper and sanding block makes quick work of the sanding step that leaves behind a 220 grit scratch on the edges and face. And it doesn't take many licks at all to put a consistent 220 grit scratch on the face and those edges. So that now I can switch to this purple 320 grit sandpaper and give those same edges and face a quick once over that gives me the butter smooth finish I want before applying gel varnish. First I do the edges, give the eased corners a quick pass, and then switch up the scratch on the face from 220 from the last step to 320 on this step. Once I'm happy with the 320 grit sanding, I take a shop cloth and wipe the dust off the surface and then inspect it with the glancing light from a flashlight. And that quick inspection assures me that this finish is smooth and consistent and everything it needs to be to accept the gel poly finish, which I will be very excited to get to after sanding all 44 of these slats. Oh boy. Well, I'm about a third of the way through my stack here and thought I would highlight one of these pieces where I chose the back face to be the front face, and so I've got to take out streaks from nicks in the planer knives because this surface was planed before I staggered the knife. I didn't mention before, but I've got a stop block here clamped down to the work surface so that my sanding tools are able to get right to the end of this piece but be held in place by that piece. Glancing light on the piece really highlights the ribs left on the piece from nicks in the joiner knives. I eliminated 99% of ribs like this when I shifted the planer knife. You can still see on what was the front side and the final pass, there's a real fine rib here. But because I selected this as the show face, got to deal with that rib this way now. With this setup, you can clearly see that rib. And if I set about sanding that with the 220 grit sandpaper, it just kind of rounds it off. It never really removes it without extensive sanding. But with a sharpened putty knife, I'm able to scrape that off with a few strokes. Just like that. And I turn that little rib into shavings with very little effort. And the surface now is left with a scratch that's equal to about 150 grit. So I don't need to hit this with 150 grit sandpaper, but I can jump right to the 220. And now you can see not only is the rib gone, but the scratch from the putty knife is gone as well, leaving nothing but a 220 grit scratch behind, which I easily remove with the 320 grit sandpaper. And that's the finish I want on the surface of all these slats when I complete the sanding steps and transition to the step where I apply the gel poly finish. And I go to great lengths to show all these steps at this stage of the game, because if I sidestep these steps at this point, when I put the gel poly on and put the slats on the door, all this stuff starts to show up, and then I have to redo things. But by doing my homework in the planing process, keeping track of things, using a consistent, proven process, I make sure that the end result is consistent and that I'm pleased with the finished product. If I don't use the thickness planer for the final pass on the faces and the edges, then at some point I've got more sanding to do, or else I'm going to have planer marks showing up in the clear finish later on. And that always leaves disappointing results. And as long as I'm off on a rabbit trail about sanding and getting perfect results, I'm going to throw in a controversial discussion here because I get a lot of questions about switching to the helical head in the DW735 thickness planer. That would be especially applicable because of this knotty wood. The helical head does a great job of handling difficult grain, but in my opinion, the surface left behind by a helical head in a thickness planer is no match for the surface left behind by a set of sharp, straight knives in the same planer. I'll shut off the shop lights as I zoom in on these pieces so you can see the texture of these boards as I explain the difference. You can see that there's a few streaks left by small nicks in those straight knife planer blades. But other than those little ribs, which are easily scraped off, the surface is nice and flat from side to side. Now compare that to this piece of maple that was run through a DW735 thickness planer with a helical head, and this is at 96 cuts per inch. Not only are there streaks from nicks in the blades, which would be eliminated if the knives were sharp or the cutters were turned, but there's scallops across the face of this piece. And to get the same finished results that I got on this piece using a few licks with a putty knife, followed by 220 grit and 320 grit sandpaper, it would take a whole lot more work to achieve those results starting out with this instead of this. And I'm girding myself right now for the flaming I'm going to get from all those who swear by that helical cutter head in their planer. I hope that any reasonable viewer can see by the comparisons I've done here why I stick with the straight knives in my thickness planer. With all that said, I firmly believe that there's definitely a place for a helical head in a thickness planer. The cutter head runs much quieter, the carbide knives are going to last a lot longer, especially with difficult, tight grain, even like this piece of maple here. The straight knives, even if they're sharp, they're going to tear this out to a greater degree than that helical cutter head will. So in a perfect world, the best setup I can think of is to have a helical head in the planer for the heavy work and then straight knives in there for the final pass. But that basically requires having two thickness planers, one with each type of cutter head. And there you have it. I rest my case. And now I got to get back to sanding. Well, finally, after a long hour of sanding, cleaning, and inspecting these pieces, I found the piece I'm looking for. The very last piece that needs to be sanded through 320 grit. And I'm thinking, I should have just put this piece on top of the stack. I could have finished up a long time ago, right? Not so lucky. Woohoo! DUN, done. With all 44 of these slats milled identically to this stage where the finish is smooth enough to apply gel poly, I'm going to clean them up, repair some minor defects and holes, etc., and then reset the work surface so I can apply gel poly. I am finally ready to put the gel poly finish on all these slats. I spent a lot more time than anticipated getting these slats ready once I made the decision to fill every knot, every nail hole, and every crack and every splinter, because I wanted to have the character of the pallet wood, but I wanted the door smooth so that I could wipe down the dust on it and apply another coat of gel poly if I needed to at some point in the future. I shot video of the repairs because some of them were pretty drastic. Ones like this, I could actually stick my pinky finger through that knot. I used a special set of steps and techniques to fill that in so it kind of blends and looks like the natural knot to the piece, even though it isn't, even though it's not. And I included that video footage in a patron-only video, so anybody who's an active patron on Patreon can see the in-depth repair process of these. But as it is, I'm just going to put the gel poly on them, and I selected 10 pieces with special character on them and stuff to feature in this segment of the video, because the rest of the slats, that's same thing, only different, rinse, lather, repeat, and I'm not going to get into it. But this is the point in the project that I always look forward to, because after spending many hours of milling and prep work and figuring and planning and working, it's at this time that all that work really starts to pay off because you can see the nature and the character of the wood that you work so hard to preserve in the process. I already mentioned I'm using the satin gel poly from Old Masters. Got this apron on because I don't want to soil my Next Level Carpentry t-shirt. Getting out of a pair of Venom nitrile gloves. They're my favorites for this. And I'll just use paper towels for wiping this down. Rags are actually better, but because of the on and off nature of video production, I end up using paper towels for it. And that makes it work out fine. And I'll just go down through this stack so you can see these things come alive. Most of you have seen me use gel poly before. If you haven't, you're in for a treat. If you have, you've got an idea of what to expect. It's such a simple finish to apply. Just take a big old wad on a paper towel and wipe it on. Shazam! You get what you get. This is one of the cleaner pieces of cherry for the project. And I'm doing front and back just to kind of help balance the moisture travel in the pieces, but that backside really isn't that necessary. And I didn't go to any great lengths to sand it because it'll just end up getting smeared over with glue. Each of these pieces has its own character, and that's really going to enhance the look of the door because even though every piece is cherry, there's no two that are identical. Some pieces have book-matched grain because they were cut out of the same pallet runners. Some of this is just staged for the video. When I'm doing these pieces on their own, without the camera rolling, I kind of pay a little more attention to each piece as I go, but I just wanted to show how that wood pops out of here on each individual piece. Some are lighter, some are darker. Big knots, little knots, checks, cracks, splinters, different numbers of nail holes in different positions. This piece you saw early on in the video, I trimmed the ends off of it. It's got that kind of crotch or burl looking grain right there. That's going to be a sharp piece for the door. Piece is even pretty on the back. This one's got some of that deep cherry character in it there. I did some filling of this knot with some of that Starbond brown CA glue to get that filled in and nice and smooth, but preserve the character of the wood. There's another one where the back is pretty interesting. This piece is unique. This knot was another, I could stick my finger through that, and I created that knot with some special techniques and materials so that it just looks like the original knot that fell out of the piece of wood at some stage of the milling process. So I think that's going to be one of my favorite pieces. I think you can see it there. This is all just perfectly smooth, even though you can still see actually down into the wood where that knot was, or where it is, as the case may be. This one's got some nice grain surrounding a knot. This was filled with Starbond black CA glue, as were the nail holes. Rather than fill those with clear, I used black or dark brown so that those are accentuated, but then they're smooth so they don't collect dirt and dust. And I'll swing the camera around so that you can get a different perspective with a little less glare from the lights as I continue to wipe the gel poly down into these pieces. And I must say I'm quite pleased with the way these pallet pieces are performing. Well, I kind of bit off more than I can chew. I should probably do about 4 of these pieces at a time, not 10. So I'm going on here like busy as a one-armed paper hanger trying to keep all this stuff going. But the good news is with gel poly, if it gets too sticky, I can always just wipe a fresh coat on with a wet rag, with a rag wet with gel poly on it, wake it back up and buff it off. So that's the upside. The other upside is the more times I wipe this, the better the finish comes out. But there's going to be a lot of nice character to distribute on the face of that door when all this gets done. So I'm going to get caught up to myself here, and I'll fire the camera back up so you can see what this batch of pieces looks like with their gel poly on them. I'm loving it. Well, I've got these things cut up. I'm kind of giving them a final wipe, and I've got to admit that it's times like this that I wish I was a whole lot better in video production than I am. This would make the great climax to a video, and I'd probably be able to get these slats put on the door in the same episode. But as it is, I've burned up so much time going off on rabbit trails and getting into the weeds on this thing that I'm going to just cut this video off here with the finishing of these slats, and then take up subsequent steps in future episodes. At this point in the video, I want to give a shout out to all the patrons on Patreon. I'm listing them here. Everybody on this scrolling list has gone above and beyond to support video production on the channel, such as it is. I think that those folks are finding good value in the content, want to support the channel, which I appreciate, and they also seem willing to put up with my lack of video production chops here. But all that, such as it is, thank you everybody on the list. If anybody's watching interested in joining that list of folks that go above and beyond, like I said before, I think there's a link in the video description. You can go there to sign up if you're so motivated. But I'm going to get these buffed down, finish up the rest of the stack, and then the next time you see these pieces will be in the next episode of the video. I think in that episode I'll be putting varnish on the door itself and hopefully installing those slats on the door, like so. So there's a lot of cool stuff coming up. I'll try to get that packaged up the best I can. But until then, as always, until next time, thanks for watching. And this is often some of the most rewarding work on a project. Wind down to the end and kind of reflect back on the job. All these old pallet pieces here that had been in the landfill a long time ago. They didn't get resurrected for the door. In days gone by, most of this stuff would have been in the trash because it's got spalting here, holes, nail holes. The only good part on the whole thing would be that piece right there. Nice vertical grain / quarter sawn cherry. The rest of this stuff is just garbage to a lot of folks. Look at that knot there. I put a piece of wood, a branch in there to kind of fill in that spot. Makes a kind of a cool looking feature on the piece. And each one of these pieces has its own features and its own character. I think these two pieces were sequentially cut. Yeah, those two are brothers there. Somehow that lines up, something like that. They're all milled down and turn into their own individual pieces. I use compressed air to blow the extra varnish out of the slots, these spline slots here. I can do that in bulk as I'm going through. Stack all the pieces on edge like this. And just blow that varnish all out at once. Buff those edges down like this, then I don't have to do them one at a time later. When you got a stack of pieces this big, you got to come up with efficiencies. This poly here is starting to get a little bit sticky, so I just take the poly rag, go back over it. That just kind of wakes it back up. Makes it easier to buff off. It's not really applying another coat because the first coat isn't set up yet, so it doesn't build. But it does allow extended work time. It's a nice clean sheen, nice clean finish on there. I can't tell this in the video, but gel poly just has an old-fashioned wood shop aroma to it. So the shop smells nice right now. It's not obnoxious. It almost smells natural, a little bit man-made, but just, the wood is just, it's just smooth as can possibly be. It's got this luster and sheen to it. It's a beautiful thing. Well, I want to thank you folks for hanging around here a little bit, watching to the end of the end of the end. These babies are going to dry. I don't think I have to give any of this stuff another coat. But I've got to get into this pile, get a good coat of varnish on all that before I call it a day. But appreciate you guys hanging out here at the end and listening to me ramble. It's kind of like that old James Taylor song. I think it's called Stay. He ends up singing in a concert hall after everybody's gone, and it's all just quiet, and you get to reflect on the work at hand, and kind of a special thing. So thanks for hanging out.